I've been told that there's quite a lot of people working on risk and uncertainty theory and decision theory and philosophy of probability. That's an area that I'm not really an expert in, but I feel that I would really benefit from people who have expertise in this area. You will see why very soon. Risk kind of figures very largely in this project. So, looking forward to your comments. My topic today is algorithmic injustice beyond discrimination. And I just thought I'd give you an overview. I kind of want to start off this talk by giving you a few very applied cases of algorithmic decision making. Some of these you might have read about in the news, some of these might be completely new to you. The aim here is to just sketch how discrimination can arise through algorithmic decision making. So what are the sources of disparate impact when we use algorithms to support or to make decisions? I will then segue into the problem of pure risk. So pure risks are risk impositions where the harm doesn't actually eventuate. And there's this really interesting literature in the ethics of risk right now where people try to determine whether some pure risks can be wrongful. And here I'll be drawing on some standard accounts, but then I'll add on an account of my own, which is all about distributing pure risks fairly. And hopefully then I will arrive at a map of what algorithmic injustice actually entails. The core claim that I kind of want to make today is that algorithmic injustice does involve discrimination, but discrimination is not the full extent of the problem. And unfortunately, this is really under-acknowledged in the debate. So even when discriminatory harm is not present, we might still have an injustice problem. And so I'll outline which other instances of moral wrongs might occur in this space. And I'll just end by outlining a few potential concerns and objections, and then hopefully you will add many more. Okay, so let's start with these four cases here. Criminal justice, law enforcement, hiring, and credit scoring. And just to jump in with the criminal justice case, this is perhaps the most widely covered case. If you present this slide at any computer science conference, people just groan and get facepalm because it's so ubiquitous. So algorithms are used in the criminal justice system at multiple junctures. One possible application is making risk assessments pre-trial. So instead of having cash bail, you use an algorithmic decision-making process to determine whether somebody's a flight risk, for instance. Very recently, a few months ago, California decided to abolish cash bail entirely, and initially social justice advocates were extremely happy about this, right? Because you kind of cut out the intersection of classist and racist bias that complicates cash bail. But then obviously the worry is, well, you're automating this decision-making process. What if this algorithm reflects existing inequalities in society and then reproduces them? The other application is predicting recidivism risk during a criminal trial. So there we can have the normal jury deliberations. We then have this algorithm that scores the risk that a particular criminal offender will recidivate, and then the judge issues their final ruling. In between this algorithmic risk scoring and the final verdict, there's no opportunities to test the risk score, which, as you can imagine, has given rise to immense outrage and democratic contestation. And I guess the main issue that people are focusing on, rightfully so, is because we have empirical data that suggests that there is an immense racial disparity when we use this technology. And the kind of seminal study in this case is the,
Just to clarify the recidivism thing, is that applied to sentencing or to actually the guilty, not guilty verdict? Is that just for sentencing, the recidivism? Yeah, that's what that's.
So there are some efforts to expand this, but currently sentencing is the main case. Right, so the seminal study here, you can't really see it on the slide, it's ProPublica. And so that was kind of the first big investigation that looked at the so-called COMPASS algorithm, which is provided by the private corporation Northpoint. So it's based on a large range of criteria, many of which are kind of intransparent, again, because this technology is provided by this private company, so we had very little insight into what is actually going on in this algorithmic decision-making process. But what we could find out is that we have a huge disparity in terms of false positive rates and false negative rates. So this is just a screenshot from that seminal ProPublica study from 2016. And so as you can see here, as a white defendant, your false positive rate is very different than if you're an African American defendant. So this gives rise to an obvious kind of worry, right? So if you have this unequal distribution of, labeling people as low risk because they're white, and then they actually go on to reoffend, but have originally gotten a much lighter sentence, right? Because this risk scoring works in such a way that kind of reinforces existing biases in society. That's kind of one clear concern. The problem, unfortunately, doesn't end there, though, right? So you might kind of say, well, let's equalize these false positive rates and these false negative rates. There's mathematical problems attached to that, but we'll ignore those. Let's assume we could actually address that accuracy problem. And so we could improve predictive accuracy across different groups. Another problem that arises is that you can actually use this technology in a fairly malicious way. And so just to give you a hypothetical example, I've included here a fairly lengthy quote from what I think is a really, really good article from the literature on fairness and machine learning, more statistically driven investigation. So unfortunately, there's not much philosophical literature on this right now, so I'm kind of drawing on that body of work that I think is really, really useful. And so the point that is just being made here is if you look at the black curve, that's kind of a risk distribution. Let's say those are the white defendants, and let's just assume you're this really evil, racist decision maker who wants to advantage this group. And the point that is being made here is that you can select this kind of cutoff threshold at 30%, where you say, well, anything above that threshold is high risk. And then you just classify these white defendants in such a way that nobody actually falls into that high risk category. Right? So the way this works is you could, take black defendants and you could sort them into multiple more fine-grained categories. And with the same kind of mean, you take that and apply it to the white defendants, but you don't sort them into these fine categories. So you then get this really spiky red distribution there. And so it kind of ends directly before this 30% cutoff. And so on that model, you still have the mean, you still have a well-calibrated algorithm that still kind of says, well, the average risk is such and such, but you actually achieve the aim of not getting any of those people detained. So this highlights a deeper problem in algorithmic decision-making. You can have calibrated algorithms that can faithfully reflect average rates across the population, but depending on how you use this data and how you rank different variables against each other, you might arrive at really, really different conclusions. So it's not a straightforward problem to address. And again, the equalizing false positive and false negative rates also wouldn't help here. So just to kind of give you a glimpse into one potential problem, there are many more. Yes?
Just a question about the percentages on the previous slide. Do you have, do you know the absolute base rates for that? Because the percentages don't indicate the absolute number of people affected. And so there's a lot of different ways that could be cashed out that's consistent with those.
This is true, right? So if you have different base rates, then you will inevitably have disparities with the false positives and false negatives. This is true, and there's a huge debate on this in computer science.
So I'm guessing that's not what's going on, but just to be sure. So is that?
So the aim here is just to show the disparity in these rates, right? But you might not be able to draw a decisive conclusion just from that data, right? So without knowing the base rates, actually this doesn't tell us that much, but this is kind of the thing that sparked the debate. So I thought it's kind of useful to include for those reasons. I'll have more of an overview over different statistical measures that we might have for algorithmic unfairness. But you're right to say that the base rates are really decisive here. So unfortunately, that wasn't a big part of that conversation.
Great.
Okay, so just to give you the second case, law enforcement. Again, there's kind of multiple ways of using algorithmic decision making here. One of them is predictive policing. And again, this becomes really worrying given that we have pervasive structures of social inequality. And the kind of specifically algorithmic problem that arises here are feedback loops. So what I have here is a crime map by the company Predictive, and it just kind of highlights high crime areas, which are essentially based on arrest rates. So that's kind of the first immediate concern. Because we can't measure actual crime, we kind of rely on this proxy of arrests. The problem is, once this algorithm tells you, oh, there's a high crime area, you just keep policing that area really, really heavily. So it kind of exacerbates the problem. Yeah?
Just as a matter of interest, does the data, does that system take account of the seriousness of the offences for which the arrests are taking place, or are they just count the number of arrests irrespective of what they're arrested for?
So Predpol is saying that this is one of the criteria, but we have little insight into how this is actually ranked against other variables. So I'm not confident in kind of making a definitive judgment on this. Surely that would seem like a really decisive problem. But yeah, unfortunately we don't have much data about it.
Yeah, I mean, if one of the squares was some trivial,
like
stealing from front garden,
yeah, exactly.
and the others were all homicides, then
right.
that would be...
So that would be one factor. I think also one consideration here, though, is that even if we have fairly low-level nonviolent crime, again, because of the racial inequality, especially in a context such as the US, if you're an African-American or another person of color, you're just much more likely to get arrested for even a nonviolent crime. So I think that compounds the problem, and it's kind of a distinct concern in addition to the pure severity metric. Right. So I essentially made this point. I mean, the one kind of interesting feature of algorithmic decision making here is that you might get a specific form of automation bias, which might then, again, exacerbate this problem. Right? So you already know, perhaps, that many police officers have implicit biases, but we also know that people are less likely to investigate these biases if there's a supposedly neutral metric that your decision making is relying on. So we have empirical data about the presence of this bias, so this seems particularly dangerous in this context. There's another case of algorithmic decision making in the context of law enforcement that I also wanted to speak about today. It's the use of real-time facial recognition technology in combination with kind of existing policing tactics like stop and search. So this is focused on the American case, but I think this will become more relevant to European countries as well over time. Currently, 50% of Americans are already in facial recognition databases, so driver's licenses, not only prior arrest records or something like that. And in many areas of the US, unfortunately the colors aren't very clear, but some of these states actually just use these driver's license databases. Now, if you have technology that allows you to engage in real-time facial recognition once you walk down a street, this might raise many complex problems. One problem is that it's unclear whether you actually need to have any sort of reasonable suspicion to run a search through this database. So this, again, might make it more likely that you have a police officer who's already biased and then decides to target one particular segment of the population and to target that segment of the population disproportionately, and then is enabled to draw on this massive large-scale database. One particularly kind of controversial and worrying case of this is the use of real-time facial recognition in border policing and immigration enforcement. So very, very recently in October 2018, we learned that Amazon met with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, to pitch their facial recognition algorithm, Recognition. And so if you can imagine, a police force or other law enforcement agencies that are interested in aggressively policing undocumented migration, if that is algorithmically enabled, that might, again, exacerbate existing structures of inequality. Just briefly turning to hiring, unfortunately it's again an Amazon case, but there's many other cases. Very often when we use algorithmic decision making to rank different applicants for jobs, we find gender bias, but we also actually find ageist bias, with younger applicants sometimes tend to be favored, especially when it's kind of a cool tech startup or something. And the rationale for that is just that, or the reason rather, is that a lot of these hiring algorithms prioritize company fit very highly. So if you have this company full of cool, young white male employees, and you say we want more people like that, then you just end up with results that make it very hard for women, racial minorities, and people of specific age groups to actually get ranked highly. It's also actually really tricky to define some of these criteria, right? So good employee is a really contested and complex category. And when we use algorithmic decision making, we obviously want to define those categories in whatever way. Now, when those categories are contested, then we quickly get problems that have to do with label bias. I'll go into that a little bit later, but the immediate concern that we see in hiring is what even constitutes a success metric or a good employee in this particular context. Another issue here is that sometimes different predictors for professional success in whatever field might be really unevenly distributed. So in tech companies, many of these algorithms used the number of years since you learned how to code as a strong indicator for future success in this particular field. And unfortunately, it's just the fact that many young boys learn coding earlier. But that wasn't necessarily predictive of the success of women in this particular field. So they might have had less years of coding experience, but might still actually be a really good employee for a specific company. So that's just a range of kind of possible complications here. The final case is credit scoring. So credit scoring is kind of roughly analogous to the other cases. So again, we can see racial and gender and class bias. But the kind of uniquely interesting feature here is that we might also have expressivist wrongs. And just to kind of illustrate what that might be, I've brought this kind of sample list of a kind of data broker agency that was featured in a US Senate committee report. And so, as you can see, the categories here are phrased in a quite stark way. So, extra needy, zero mobility, and particularly ethnic second city strugglers and rural and buried and even making it kind of caught my eye. There's many others that are kind of obviously worrying. And so these are the categories that data brokers then use to classify people and to identify their creditworthiness. Now you might think, well, if people aren't aware that data brokers use these categories for credit scoring, then the expressivist wrong worry kind of disappears. Right? So how can you be offended if you don't know that this is happening? But I just wanted to flag it as a possible argument regardless. And again, I want to build some arguments on this later. So this is another potential wrong-making feature of algorithmic decision-making. So whenever we can have demeaning variables, demeaning categories that either reinforce bias or just can create new offensive categories, that might be a kind of moral concern. Right, so just to kind of tie this together and to show how potential kind of disparate impact or discriminatory harm might arise in algorithmic decision-making, I just wanted to give you a slightly more technical overview over how learning algorithms work. I won't go into the intricacies of reinforcement learning, supervised learning, unsupervised learning. I think all you really need to know in order to understand how potential problems arise is you need to know that an algorithm is this kind of precise list of precise instructions that learns from historical instances. So this training data is used for an inductive process. That's all there is to it. It's not particularly complicated beyond that. So we then have kind of decision rules or classifiers according to which this algorithm draws on this historical data. The data attributes that we have in this algorithm are called features. This term will be important in a second. And the whole set of the available features is the feature space. Right. So just to map the problem space, now that you've kind of seen this flow of the algorithmic decision-making process, I think there's 4 points where, from a technical perspective, we could see disparate impact arising. So the first one is when we define the target variable. I mentioned this briefly before, so especially when we have a contested concept, that can be really tricky. The second one is when we label and collect the training data. The third one is when we select features. And then the fourth one is decision-making based on that resulting model that we came up with according to this classifier. So just to kind of go through some of these technical problems in turn. Unfortunately, I don't have the space today to dive deeper into it, but just to kind of give you a brief overview over the best statistical and computer science literature in this area. So the first one we already kind of covered. So whenever I want to come up with a class label, which then helps me kind of separate all possible instances into different camps, so to speak, I need to somehow define what I will use to assess a specific thing. So again, high risk would be a really interesting and tricky thing to define because it might interact with many other concepts and features. Creditworthiness, we already talked about. Good company fit, we already talked about. All of that is kind of emblematic of this problem. Regarding the second point, there's multiple ways in which labeling and collecting training data might be complicated. The first one is just that data often acts as a social mirror, in the sense that, especially if you have a supervised learning environment where I have a really well-calibrated algorithm that faithfully reflects whatever status quo I have, it just kind of reproduces whatever correlations we already find in society. This will mean that the algorithm also reproduces correlations that you would find morally objectionable, but that unfortunately aren't there. So, for instance, the correlation between smoking and lung cancer is perhaps a morally unobjectionable correlation, whereas girls plus pink, or like girls plus nurse rather than doctor, is obviously a correlation that we often see in many social contexts, but this algorithm has no way of telling which correlation is morally objectionable or not. So data as a social mirror can be avoided for that reason. The next one would be sample bias. So whenever I have unrepresentative training data, that can create massive problems. And I guess the main worry here is that for smaller groups, we often have less representative data. And then once we try to get more data on our kind of pool, we will then have even more for the advantage group in society. So there's a lot of kind of statistical literature right now that is concerned with how to correct for this unrepresentativeness in the training data. And I guess obviously both over and underrepresentation might be a problem here. So it's not that only underrepresentation is the kind of worry. The third one is label bias, so that's just a measurement error. So recall the criminal justice case that we talked about before, the predictive policing case. It's just, again, if I try to measure criminality via arrests, that might create label bias, but there's many other cases where that's true. Just on the third point, so I maybe won't go into all of these details here, but one kind of trendy topic in fairness in machine learning research right now is whether we should explicitly use protected categories like race and gender. And then if we find that our algorithmic decision-making doesn't work equally for those groups, if we should have different decision rules across different groups. So you might imagine that there's a kind of drawback here if we explicitly adopt different decision rules for different groups. But I guess the counterpoint to that people make is that this would improve predictive accuracy. And then again, we have cases like digital redlining, which we already discussed before. So using compiling general criteria, really coarse-grained information, and even doing so in a deliberate way will create discriminatory harm. finally, there's a number of worries about decision making. I think feedback loops is perhaps the more interesting case. There's other kinds of situations. What interests me about feedback loops is that there we really see very clearly that the training set itself changes according to the decision rule. So there we have kind of an interesting interaction with problems. So once I take action based on a particular classifier, then I will exacerbate existing issues. Right, so this brings me to the point about discriminatory harm and algorithmic injustice. So my claim is that a lot of people who are interested in algorithmic injustice rightfully kind of diagnose the presence of discrimination or at least disparate impact. And then kind of say, well, algorithmic decision making is basically a case of imposing discriminatory harm, so it's a kind of impure risk imposition in the sense that I impose this risk of harm on a particular population, and then if it eventuates, that's discriminatory. So I'm drawing here on a kind of conceptual category which was introduced by Thompson, but also other people in that ethics of risk debate. So the contrast again would just be that pure risk imposition that never eventuates. Now, obviously, defining what constitutes discriminatory harm is notoriously contested. I'm not going to try to define this concept in this talk. I suppose there are some cases that are uncontroversially instances of discriminatory harm. I'm hoping that I've convinced you already that at least some of these cases constitute discrimination. If that's not the case, assume a case that you see as uncontroversially discriminatory. Nothing really hinges on that particular point. So just assuming that discriminatory harm is a category that can be defined, at least in a fuzzy way, that's kind of the conceptual underpinning for this talk. One caveat on this, saying that discriminatory harm is a useful conceptual category for conceptualizing part of what makes algorithmic injustice, doesn't commit me to a harm-based account of discrimination. So if some of you are perhaps working on philosophy of discrimination, you might know that one account of what makes discrimination wrong is a kind of consequentialist account, like the one that Casper Lindbergh Rasmussen or Richard Arneson defended. I'm not committed to this particular account. So I actually think that discrimination can be wrong, even if no harm is present. But obviously, one important aspect of discrimination in some instances is discriminatory harm. Just to clarify that. Right. These discriminatory harms can be exacerbated by many things that might have democratic or just broadly political and social significance. One issue is kind of low explainability, so very often we have very little insight into how a particular algorithm survives in particular decisions. This might be because a private corporation produced this algorithm, or it might just be that we can get unexpected results that we can't mathematically understand. Yet sometimes we can get technical complexities that are also hard to model. Then we have low contestability on top of that. Right? So it's one thing to explain something, but it's a whole other story to justify something normatively. And I suppose my assumption here is one key component of democratic justification would be the opportunity to engage in political controversy and contestation about whether technology should be used, what type of technology should be used, whether we should automate some decisions at all, or whether we want to stick with human decision makers. And so with algorithmic decision-making, there's multiple junctures in the democratic process where that is currently not happening. Then, again, we have automation bias, as I mentioned before. This might exacerbate this justifiability gap. And then we have multiple instances of risk and uncertainty that can interact in complex ways. So algorithmic decision-making is kind of inherently predictive, so we're always kind of working under risk and uncertainty to some extent. But then we also sometimes don't know what sort of parameters we should use to evaluate particular algorithmic decision-making outcomes. There might be different plausible conceptions of risk that we might use. So should we see risk as this kind of objectivist concept? So should we decide to impose risk on particular agents regardless of what their risk preferences are? Or should we actually have a purely preference-based account of risk imposition. So how risk averse is this particular agent, and does this give us any sort of guidance on what we ought to do in the scenario? So there's multiple complexities here, and none of them are obvious, and when they interact, the uncertainty problem exacerbates the fairness problem. Right, so you might think, well, how do I deal with the standard case? You could say, well, let's try to recognize these instances of discriminatory harm that have already happened, and let's compensate for those. And then let's try to improve the accuracy of these algorithms to avoid future discriminatory harm. I call this a naive suggestion because it seems obviously naive to me, but I've encountered this potential solution many times at computer science conferences, so it seemed sufficiently non-obvious to me to put it up there. Just to kind of walk you through what could possibly go wrong with this, there's major practical problems attached to this particular solution. One has to do with the fact that optimizing for accuracy is often computationally immensely costly, and sometimes it's even mathematically impossible. So very often you can get trade-offs between different fairness metrics, or accuracy metrics as well. And so in that case, you're just facing a real feasibility problem in terms of getting perfect accuracy. And then we might also have institutional constraints. Yeah?
Very small question. When you say accuracy, are you making distinction between accuracy and precision? And if so, do you really mean optimizing for just accuracy?
Oh, so people also talk about optimizing precision, but the bulk of the debate that I'm focusing on is focusing on accuracy. So I really mean accuracy, but we could also talk about precision, which also seems important. Yeah, but this argument is really about accuracy. Then in addition to these practical problems, I think there's major normative concerns, and as I told you at the beginning of this talk, I guess my main concern would be that even if I don't have discriminatory harm, then I would still have moral wrongdoing that is involved in algorithmic decision making. But for the moment, I just want to assume that we could actually achieve a somehow satisfactory level of accuracy, however one might define that, right? So the kind of counterfactual case that I'm imagining here is we have this perfectly accurate algorithm, or sufficiently perfectly accurate algorithm, which does not involve imposing impure risk impositions, so discriminatory harm, on persons. Now, would anything be morally wrong with using that algorithm in all these cases that we outlined before, so criminal justice, hiring, credit scoring, whatever? And so again, here the task would be to test that counterfactual case by looking at the question whether algorithmic decision-making involves pure risk impositions, which are morally wrong, right? So it's not obvious that pure risk is morally wrong. Yeah?
Can I just ask, so the counterfactual case, I mean, how is that constructed as opposed to doing what? As opposed to not using anything, or as opposed to some guy sitting there and making a decision instead? Because it seems to be important to figure out what the alternative is.
Right, so it's actually just the alternative to the standard case, not to the human decision-making case. Should have specified that. But yeah, you could actually also compare those scenarios. And people do that a lot in the literature, but then they kind of conclude, well, if I can cut out human implicit bias, then clearly this speaks in favor of using algorithmic decision-making methods.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking, exactly, yeah.
Right. So the case that I'm thinking of here is just modify that standard case in a way that doesn't have this accuracy problem. But I guess, yeah, not much hinges on the phrasing. Because the actual claim that I want to make is the actual scenario, or the actual nature of algorithmic injustice, is this combined scenario of kind of impure risk impositions, which are discriminatory harm, and kind of pure risk impositions, where harm doesn't eventuate, but I still either disrespect people, or I treat them as agents of unequal moral status, or agents unworthy of equal consideration. What exactly the wrong-making features of these pure risks are, though, is really contested, and that's the open question that I want to look at now. So consider this case, so just a standard stop and search case, right? So I have this society that implements this policy, and then I have this member of the racial minority, A. Now, A never gets stopped and searched by the police, right, ever. But A knows that there's all of these other agents who are also members of this racial minority, and they do get stopped and searched. So what follows for A? A might be making really different decisions than A would have otherwise made to avoid this adverse consequence of being subject to privacy infringements and the dignity infringements of being stopped and searched by law enforcement. Now, there's one particular account that explains why pure risks can be wrong. It's the kind of autonomy-based account that people like John Overdyk and Ronald Roykin have defended. So this account says, here we infringe on A's valuable choice set because A makes other choices than he or she otherwise would have made. And this risk imposition is problematic because it creates the possibility of harm. Very often people approach risk as a probability issue, but actually in this case, because we've adopted this policy, we've just made it possible that the stop and search scenario can happen for A. Right? And so in Overdyk's words, here the risk imposition normatively forecloses formally safe possibilities, and this is what he sees as this kind of objectionable autonomy infringement, where my basic interest in autonomous decision-making is set back significantly by the presence of this pure risk, despite the fact that I, as an individual agent, never actually experienced the associated harm. I want to test this account, though, just because there's many other features that could make pure risk impositions wrong. So consider this kind of Russian roulette case, where Anna and Beth, and Anna just kind of wants to play Russian roulette with Beth. And Beth is really lucky in the scenario because Anna fires the revolver and there's no bullets, so Beth survives. And so Anna is really callous about this. She's like, well, no harm, no foul. You have no complaint against me. So this is the intriguing test case here, because if the pure risk imposition is indeed not wrong, then no apology necessary, right? Now, I can think of many different intuitions why this particular scenario is potentially morally objectionable. So one immediate one is that Anna kind of deliberately exposed Beth to the severe danger, lethal harm. Then the lack of consent might play a role. That's a kind of complicating factor. Some might be able, or might be inclined to say that if Beth had previously consented to this risk imposition, she would have voluntarily assumed this risk, and that might either make that risk imposition not wrong, or it might make it less wrong. Then, the basic interest in autonomy is affected, but also the basic interest in well-being, right? So this exposure to this severe lethal danger, at least from an exposed perspective, might be super traumatizing for Beth or something. So there's also well-being-based accounts of the wrongness of pure risk. Then the lack of respect for Beth's life might be just a worry in and of itself. Or just the objectionable kind of wait-and-see attitude, right? So can Beth only complain once she's actually been shot? Like, that seems really callous on some level. So sometimes you want to assess particular dangers from this ex-ante perspective to avoid this just wait-and-see attitude. But I said that I wanted to test this autonomy-based account, right? So we can see that, yes, there's many intuitions that can explain why pure risk is wrong here, but you can couch this case as an autonomy-based case, right? So we can still make this Overdyk-Roykin-style argument about why this pure risk is wrong. But consider now this case, stealthy Russian roulette, where Anna just hides this revolver behind some sort of screen contraption, and so Beth now doesn't know that she's being exposed to this risk, right? And so again, same scenario in a way, the revolver fires, Beth survives this one too, and again, Anna wants to argue, well, you survived this, and you didn't even have to fret about it. You didn't even know about it. So what's the problem? So the objection here is, well, how can your autonomy be affected on this Overdyk-Roykin account if you don't even know about the presence of this pure risk? Now, I personally have a view on this. I I'm going to foreshadow this by saying that you don't necessarily need to buy into this response in order to agree with the rest of my argument. But just to let you know, I think even in the stealthy Russian roulette case, withholding information actually does affect autonomy in a significant way. So Anna still kind of deliberately concealed the presence of this revolver behind the screen, and that seems really objectionable inherently, right? So Beth would have made really different choices had this information not been withheld from her. And for that reason, I think actually the autonomy account is more expensive than it might seem. But it's also fine if you just want to apply it to the Russian roulette and the kind of stop and search case. Now, of course, if we think about applying this to the algorithmic decision-making cases, again, you might think, well, the autonomy-based argument kind of captures a lot of what might be wrong with pure risks that result from algorithmic decision-making, right? Where we have some sort of disparate impact that is empirically observable, but then we have some agents who never actually experience a harm, a kind of tangible setback of their interests. And so you might have this intuition, well, if I know that people like me suffer an infringement of their privacy rights, I might make different choices. If I know that my rights are less secure or kind of less enforceable, I might make different choices. So a lot of these kind of reasons can be subsumed in this autonomy-based account of what makes pure risk impositions wrong. Unfortunately, I think there's still a dimension of pure risk that is not captured in this autonomy-based paradigm. And it's just the fact that I still have this unfair distribution of pure risks. So that seems to be operating in a distinct way from this autonomy consideration. And so just before I can outline in detail how this might happen with algorithmic decision-making, I think this concern about distributing pure risks fairly is a really important research gap. There's not really much literature on this specific problem. And so I guess the first intervention that I think would be useful is an intervention just into the ethics of risk debate, where we don't really have a cohesive account that kind of tells us why unfair pure risk distributions themselves can be morally objectionable in a way that doesn't piggyback onto existing accounts of the wrong-making features of pure risk. But there's also an important gap in the literature in discrimination. So you might be familiar with non-consequentialist, deontological accounts of what might make discrimination wrong. Now, unfortunately, again, a lot of this literature focuses on tangible harm, so impure risk impositions, but many of the scenarios that they discuss could be couched as pure risk scenarios. And my claim is that actually this concern for distributing pure risk fairly is compatible, or potentially compatible, with a lot of existing accounts. Not all of them apply very well to algorithmic decision-making in particular. So one challenge, for instance, is that some of these accounts focus a lot on discriminatory intent. The challenge in the algorithms case is that very often it's really hard to show intent, or you have actually unintended consequences. But there might be other accounts, so kind of arbitrary treatment, or kind of expressing attitudes or reflecting attitudes at least that are somehow morally objectionable. That could actually also apply to this pure risk case. So I think this is a kind of useful addition to a really rich debate that could be even richer in this area. And then finally, we have this computer science, machine learning, statistics literature that actually doesn't focus at all on pure risks. They're really, really focused on just, the actual procedures that algorithms go through, and then, whether discriminatory harm happens or not. So this is massively under-researched in that corner of that debate. But let's focus a little bit more precisely on unfair risk distributions, or unfair pure risk distributions in algorithmic decision-making. Right? So if we just kind of think about these cases from before, and I just assume that there's multiple agents in these scenarios. And so again, the autonomy account kind of applies to all of these cases, but assume that A's interests are kind of affected disproportionately by this because she kind of bears pure risks to a larger extent or of a more severe nature. If such a situation arises, I would claim that the mere fact that the pure risk is distributed disproportionately on A is a kind of wrong-making feature that can be explained exclusively by an autonomy-based account, or even by respect, or non-arbitrariness, or merit-based account. Right? So we kind of need this distributive perspective between different agents to really get to the core of what goes wrong here, amongst other things, right? So I'm not claiming that this is the only explanation for why pure risks can be wrong, and I'm not claiming that it's the main one, but I think it's a really important one. And so this is what we have to take into account when we define algorithmic decision making. We might think that these pure risks are only potential morally wrong. So the question of whether imposing them is all things considered justifiable is obviously a really separate question. But I think in order to arrive at a thorough concept of algorithmic injustice, we need to go through the step where we define at least the potential wrongs that are involved in this process. Now, interestingly, even though I say that this particular wrong-making feature is distinct from other wrong-making features, I don't want to deny that different wrong-making features can interact with each other, so they could very well exacerbate each other. So just as a kind of clarification, I don't want to deny that claim. And even, I might have some cases where an equal distribution might still be morally objectionable. So this is another caveat. So imagine kind of a mass surveillance case where I'm just assuming that despite the fact that I have massive kind of social injustice, I still kind of surveil every member of my population equally. And I might still have moral objections to this particular practice. So again, this kind of claim is compatible with my account because I'm not saying that the fairness of pure risk distributions is the only or the decisive feature. I also want to highlight that sometimes I find equal or supposedly neutral distributions of pure risks, but whenever they operate under de facto conditions of inequality, they will be leading to unequal results. So that's kind of worth stressing in this context, because I'm seeing a lot of kind of technology policy right now that seems to basically be analogous to the ideal of colorblindness. So this kind of notion of neutrality can be severely misleading here. And so we shouldn't necessarily assume that equal distributions are inherently unobjectionable. Right? So that's not an upshot of my talk. Now, just to kind of tie this concept of algorithmic injustice together, what I've tried to argue here is that harm isn't decisive for the question whether algorithmic decision-making constitutes algorithmic injustice. So of course I'm not saying that all possible instances of algorithmic decision-making are instances of algorithmic injustice, even though I started out with a whole range of very negative examples. But I haven't committed myself to a kind of maximalist, technology-skeptical claim. But I do think that we need a more nuanced understanding of what algorithmic injustice actually is. Now then I've argued that pure risks are a really important metric for harmless discriminatory impact in the context of algorithmic injustice. And so I've then also admitted that these potential wrongful risk distributions may not be all things considered morally wrong. So I do want to say that that's a separate question, and that would then require weighing competing moral values against the value of non-discrimination itself, right? So that's well beyond the scope of this project. So I'll not settle this question, but the kind of intervention that I've had into this conceptual debate on algorithmic injustice is just to say a necessary step for determining this all things considered justifiability, although not a sufficient step, is to have a cohesive account of what type of problem algorithmic injustice even is. So the intervention here is it's not purely a discriminatory harm problem, despite the fact that the bulk of the debate on this focuses on discriminatory harm. And so this has been the main upshot of this talk. defining what kind of problem algorithmic injustice is just kind of much more expansive than one might guess once one looks at the empirical evidence. So I've constructed this kind of tentative map. I haven't discussed all of these instances in this talk, but just to kind of walk you through it. So we've begun with this distinction between impure risk impositions and pure risk impositions, so harm or no harm. And then on the harm side, you might obviously have morally wrong instances of harm impositions, but you might well have totally morally innocuous harm impositions for whatever reasons. I haven't discussed those at all, right? So I've bracketed those. And then even with the morally wrong harms, not all of those harm impositions might be harmful discrimination. So I've not focused on harmful non-discrimination here. Although I don't want to exclude it from the concept of algorithmic injustice, because I think that even if discrimination is not present, you might still have unjust harm impositions, or unjust harm distributions, rather. I just haven't developed an account for this. Then on the no harm side, again focusing on the morally wrong dimension of pure risk, I've talked about the autonomy account, I've talked about the unfair risk distribution account, but I also want to stress that future research is really needed to map other possible wrong-making features here. So I haven't tried to develop a kind of comprehensive theory of this, but I think this unfair risk distribution case is really obvious and kind of under-researched, so therefore worth stressing as an important part of this concept. Yes, and then the non-morally wrong pure risk impositions I've obviously excluded and therefore grayed out here in this map. They're just not part of algorithmic injustice. Great, so talking about a few concerns, just to kind of conclude this talk. The first concern that I see is somebody might say, well, risk of discrimination is not the same as discrimination, right? So any sort of argument that tries to put those on the same moral baseline will seem somewhat counterintuitive, right? So somebody who's actually bearing discriminatory harm will probably rightfully tell us, well, you know, it's easy for you. You don't actually have to bear this burden. A risk of harm or discriminatory harm might well be morally objectionable, but it's just not the same as a risk of discrimination. Then the second concern is not all disproportionate risk distributions are necessarily unfair. And the third one would be that there are some fair risk distributions that are all things considered unjustifiable, depending on what other values are floating around in our decision-making models. So liberty and security might be one of those possible considerations, but there are many more. The objection that I want to talk about is the unfairness of this kind that we see in all of these algorithmic decision-making cases is unavoidable in the sense that it constitutes a hard feasibility constraint, because the alternative would be risk paralysis, right? So if I try to avoid imposing all sorts of pure risks on people, I can't really do anything, so it kind of implies an extreme precautionary principle. And so just to respond to that, the three concerns are in fact compatible with my view. So if you endorse any of these three concerns or all of them, then that wouldn't be a reason to reject this account of what constitutes algorithmic injustice. And in response to the objection, I would just say that we then also need a risk-sensitive theory of feasibility. And unfortunately, we don't really have a cohesive theory in this context. So I fully acknowledge that this is a concern, but I don't think we need to immediately conclude that a concern for avoiding morally wrongful pure risk impositions necessarily implies risk paralysis. But I do think we need to factor in feasibility concerns here. So that's a nice opportunity for further research and